Avoidants never fear losing control. They fear being understood. They thought you were easy to read, easy to manipulate, easy to distance from. They mistook your calm for cluelessness, your patience for passivity, your silence for softness. But you weren't naive. You were studying their patterns, their triggers, their silence. You watched how they withdrew when emotions got real, how they shut down when vulnerability crept in, how they used distance as a shield whenever connection felt too close. You noticed the way their energy shifted, the way their tone sharpened, the way their presence faded the moment intimacy required honesty. And while they believed you were simply accepting their behavior, you were quietly decoding every move. You weren't confused. You were collecting clarity. Clarity about who they were, clarity about what they feared, clarity about how deeply their avoidance ran. Empaths don't miss details, they absorb them. And you absorbed every contradiction, every mixed signal, every emotional retreat, without ever needing to confront it directly. You saw the wounds beneath their defenses, the fear under their detachment, the longing behind their distance. You understood that avoidants don't pull back because they don't care. They pull back because they care too much and don't trust themselves to handle it. They thought you were oblivious, but you were merely observing, gathering the truth slowly and quietly, the way empaths do. The avoidant expected you to be reactive, dramatic, or demanding. That's the pattern they're used to. But instead, you gave them something far more dangerous to their defenses: emotional intelligence. You didn't chase them. You didn't question your worth. You didn't internalize their withdrawal. You simply watched, learned, and adjusted. That's the moment everything shifted. Because avoidance can manage distance, but they cannot manage being seen. And the moment they realized you were not the naive, hopeful soul they assumed you were, but someone who understood their behavior with startling accuracy, their sense of control dissolved. They realized you weren't falling apart. You were waking up. You weren't clinging to them. You were studying the emotional blueprint they never meant to reveal. You weren't waiting for them to change. You were understanding why they couldn't. And that understanding, that's what terrifies an avoidant more than any confrontation, any argument, any goodbye ever could. Because being understood means being exposed, and being exposed means losing the ability to hide behind distance. So now the avoidant sits with a truth they never expected. You weren't naive, you simply saw more than you ever spoke. And the quiet power of that realization is something they never prepared for. Your quiet wasn't weakness, it was data. Avoidants assume the loudest person wins. They think the one who reacts, the one who chases, the one who demands clarity is the one who cares the most. They're used to chaos, emotional intensity, and dramatic responses. So when you responded with calm, steady silence, they misread it as fragility. But you didn't play their game. You didn't give them the emotional explosions they're conditioned to expect. Instead, you did something far more powerful. You watched how they pulled back the moment things became emotionally real, how they tested your patience through distance, how they offered breadcrumbs of connection, just enough to keep you close, but never enough to feel secure. You paid attention to the moments their walls went up, the subtle shift in their tone, the way their eyes changed when vulnerability brushed too close. You saw how they feared intimacy yet craved closeness, how they longed for connection but sabotaged anything that resembled emotional safety. And without ever needing to call it out, you became fluent in their attachment style, reading patterns they weren't conscious of, understanding fears they didn't have language for, navigating emotional landscapes they've spent their whole life avoiding. Your quiet wasn't passivity, it was perception. You weren't shrinking, you were studying. Every delayed response, every abrupt emotional withdrawal, every moment of tension became information. You were learning their survival strategies, the ways they tried to keep their heart protected, the ways they panicked when someone saw too much. And you learned quickly that their distancing wasn't personal, it was habitual. Their detachment wasn't rejection, it was fear wearing armor. You understood that avoidants don't run because of who you are. They run because of what closeness wakes up inside them. So instead of reacting, you observed. Instead of chasing, you listened. Instead of demanding clarity, you collected it quietly, piece by piece. What they interpreted as you not noticing was actually the opposite. You noticed more than they ever intended you to. You just chose to stay grounded rather than emotional. Your quiet became the space in which their patterns revealed themselves. Your presence became the mirror that reflected their fears back at them. You learned their attachment style better than they understood their own, because while they were busy managing their emotions through avoidance, you were understanding the emotional architecture beneath it. And that's the moment the dynamic shifted, even if they didn't fully realize it at first. Avoidance feels safe when someone reacts loudly because they can blame the chaos and disconnect. But your silence didn't give them a script to hide behind. It didn't give them an excuse, it only exposed what was already there. Your quiet wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. It was strength. It was clarity gathering in the background. It was you seeing everything they thought they concealed. And deep down, that realization shakes an avoidant in a way no confrontation ever could. They misread your softness as blindness. Avoidants often confuse gentleness with ignorance, and they mistook your kindness for a lack of awareness, but you weren't blind. Not for a moment. You simply had no desire to expose their wounds or throw their fears back at them. You could see the cracks in their armor, the tremors beneath their confidence, the vulnerability hidden behind every moment of detachment. You saw the little boy or little girl inside them who learned long ago that closeness equals danger, that emotions equal chaos, that love equals loss. And because you're an empath, you didn't attack, you absorbed. You absorbed their mood shifts, their withdrawal, their sudden aloofness. You absorbed their patterns until you understood the rhythm of their fear better than they ever could. Empaths don't expose people, they illuminate them quietly. And you absorbed enough to understand the truth behind every push, every retreat, every silent test. When they said they needed space, you heard, I'm overwhelmed and I don't know how to hold this. When they became cold, you sensed, I'm scared you'll see how deeply I feel. When they pulled away, you understood it as a reflex, not rejection. You saw through the disguise they rely on so heavily, the mask of indifference that cracks every time they feel too much. And instead of punishing them for it, you let them be. But here's the part they never saw coming. Absorbing is not the same as accepting. You didn't absorb to tolerate their behavior. You absorbed to understand it. And understanding is while they believed you were falling for their avoidance cycles, you were simply reading the emotional weather of their inner world. You were learning the difference between their silence born from fear and their silence born from avoidance. You were observing the pattern that repeated every time intimacy reached a depth they weren't prepared to handle. And you pieced together the truth they've been running from their entire life, that they sabotage connection not because it isn't real, but because it is. Your softness wasn't naivety, it was emotional intelligence. You didn't confront them because confrontation isn't the empath's default language. You communicate through understanding, through presence, through intuition. And while they misinterpreted that as blindness, you were actually seeing them with a clarity that terrified them more than any words ever could. Because avoidants don't fear being judged, they fear being known. And you knew the difference between their emotional walls and their emotional needs. You knew when their distance was self-protection and when it was habit. You knew when they were overwhelmed and when they were hiding. And the more you saw, the more your softness became something they couldn't escape. Because an empath's awareness is quiet, but absolute. You weren't blind. You were observing, understanding, decoding. And now the avoidant realizes something that unsettles them to their core. Your softness was not weakness. It was insight. It was strength. It was truth. And the truth is what they fear most. You saw every red flag, you just didn't react to them emotionally. Avoidance? Think you don't notice the micro behaviors, the delayed replies, the sudden withdrawal, the rigid boundaries that appear out of nowhere, the moment feelings deepen. They assume you're too distracted by your own emotions to recognize their patterns, as if their subtle distancing goes unseen. But you noticed everything. You saw the way they hesitated before committing to plans, the way their tone shifted when conversations grazed vulnerability, the way their energy changed when connection felt too real too fast. You saw how they seemed present one moment and unreachable the next, how their warmth became caution, how their openness tightened into guarded half responses. And while most people would react, confront, or panic, you did. You just chose not to respond emotionally because reaction feeds their fear and fear fuels their retreat. Avoidants don't run from people. They run from emotional intensity. And you understood that. You recognized that reacting emotionally, demanding answers, forcing conversations, chasing after reassurance would only push them further into their shell. So instead of reacting, you observed. You stayed grounded, not because you didn't feel anything, but because you understood what their behavior truly meant. You knew the difference between malice and fear, between indifference and overwhelm. You knew their red flags weren't weapons, they were shields, and shields don't need to be attacked. They need to be understood. Your lack of reaction wasn't disinterest, it was emotional strategy. You didn't mirror their withdrawal with coldness, you didn't question your worth every time they pulled away. You didn't try to force the pace of the connection. You gave them the one thing avoidants secretly crave, but rarely receive: emotional neutrality. A safe space where their fear didn't cause chaos, where their retreat didn't trigger rejection, where their silence didn't spark conflict. And while you didn't say it aloud, your actions communicated an unspoken truth. I see you. I understand this. I don't need to explode for you to feel safe. But ironically, your calm awareness is what eventually shook them. Avoidants rely on emotional reactions as a way to validate their fears. When someone overreacts, it reinforces their belief that intimacy is dangerous. But when you didn't react, when you didn't spiral, when you didn't chase or collapse, they were forced to face the truth about themselves. Your non-reaction held up a mirror to their behavior. It revealed their avoidance patterns without you ever having to expose them directly. And that quiet clarity is far more powerful than any confrontation could have been. Because deep down, the avoidant realized something they never expected. You weren't missing the red flags. You were simply choosing not to let them control you. You stayed present without being needy. You stayed aware without being reactive. You stayed connected without demanding more than they could give. And that level of emotional mastery is something avoidants are both drawn to and terrified of. You saw every red flag, you just didn't let them define the story. You didn't let them dictate your worth. You didn't let them derail your clarity. And now the avoidant understands the unsettling truth. Your calm wasn't ignorance, it was discernment. And discernment is a power they never expected you to have. Avoidants fear emotional intelligence because it can't be controlled. Avoidants can manage distance, silence, mixed signals, and emotional push-pull. They know how to outmaneuver people who react impulsively, people who beg for clarity, people who fight to keep the connection alive. But emotional intelligence, that's their kryptonite. Because emotional intelligence doesn't chase, it doesn't panic, it doesn't get manipulated by silence or swayed by withdrawal. Emotional intelligence sees. And avoidants don't know how to hide from someone who sees them clearly. When an avoidant realizes you can read them deeper than they've ever read themselves, that's when their entire defense system begins to crumble. They've spent their whole lives believing their emotional walls make them unreadable, that no one can truly understand them or get close enough to touch their vulnerabilities. But then you came along with intuition, empathy, and a level of understanding they never prepared for. You weren't thrown by their distance. You weren't confused by their sudden shutdowns. You weren't destabilized by their contradictions. You didn't internalize their coldness or personalize their retreat. Instead, you recognized what every avoidant desperately tries to hide, that beneath the withdrawal lies longing, beneath the silence lies overwhelm, beneath the distance lies fear. You didn't just see their behavior, you understood the psychology behind it. And that kind of awareness is something they can't run from because it follows them even when they retreat. You became a mirror reflecting their patterns, their wounds, their coping mechanisms. And mirrors make avoidance uncomfortable because they spend their lives avoiding themselves. Suddenly, they weren't outrunning someone who needed them. They were outrunning someone who understood them. And understanding is far more threatening than needed. Understanding means visibility. Visibility means vulnerability. Vulnerability means danger, at least to an avoidance emotional wiring. But here's the twist. The person they were trying to outrun was the only person who actually saw them. Most people only see the mask, the confident exterior, the aloof persona, the self-sufficient facade. But you saw the human beneath it. You saw the softness they suppress, the sensitivity they hide, the craving for connection they deny even to themselves. Your emotional intelligence reached them in a way they didn't consent to and didn't know how to shield themselves from. And that's why their defenses began collapsing without you lifting a finger. They withdrew and you understood. They shut down and you stayed grounded. They ran and you stayed still. And that stillness, that non-reactive presence, that's what exposed them. Because you weren't intoxicated by their charm or blinded by their distance. You were aware, deeply aware. You were the one person they couldn't hide from, and that realization shakes an avoidant to their core. They finally understand that you weren't trying to invade their emotional space. You were simply able to see what others overlooked. And being seen, truly seen, is the one thing they never learned how to handle. You were giving them space, not giving up. Avoidants misinterpret everything through the lens of fear, and so they misinterpreted your patience as passivity. To them, space is usually a sign of fading interest, emotional withdrawal, or the beginning of an ending. They expected you to mirror their distance with frustration, clinginess, or emotional pressure. But you didn't. You didn't chase, you didn't panic, you didn't demand, and you didn't collapse. Instead, you stepped back with quiet confidence, not to detach, but to understand, because you weren't waiting, you were watching. You were watching how their energy shifted when intimacy grew, watching how quickly they retreated the moment they felt emotionally seen, watching the way they pushed you away, not because you were wrong for them, but because you were right in ways that scared them. Empaths don't chase. They observe long enough to understand who someone really is. You knew that pressuring an avoidant only deepens their fear, so you chose softness over force, patience over panic, and clarity over chaos. You gave them room to breathe, room to retreat, room to feel without feeling cornered. You gave them the space they needed, not because you were weak or unsure, but because you recognized their silence wasn't about you. It was about their unhealed stories, their learned survival strategies, their belief that closeness equals danger. You understood that space is the only language avoidants trust, so you spoke it fluently. But what they never realized was that your space wasn't empty. It was intentional. It was filled with awareness, compassion, and discernment. You weren't stepping back out of confusion. You were stepping back to see the bigger picture. You were watching how they handled your absence, how they filled the silence, how they navigated the distance they created. You were learning what their attachment wounds looked like up close without letting those wounds drag you into emotional disorder. The space you gave wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Because an empath's strength isn't loud, it's quiet. It's in their ability to observe without absorbing, to understand without excusing, to stay present without losing themselves. And the avoidant, who believed you had drifted away emotionally, didn't realize that your presence was still rooted and intact, just not reactive. They thought you stopped caring when in reality, you were caring in a way they never experienced without pressure, without fear, without emotional manipulation. You weren't trying to keep them. You were trying to understand them. And that difference is something avoidants rarely encounter. Eventually, the truth confronts them. You didn't step back to escape. You stepped back because you respected their pace. You weren't giving up on them. You were giving them the emotional room their nervous system needed to feel safe. But the more they sat with that space, the more they realized it wasn't abandonment. It was stability. It wasn't indifference. It was emotional maturity. You weren't gone, you were grounded. And that groundedness is what now follows them, even in the silence they thought would make you disappear. Their silent test revealed more about them than about you. Avoidance test loyalty through distance. They use silence as a measuring tool, disappearing not to hurt you, but to see if you'll react in a way that confirms their fears. They think withdrawing gives them answers. Will you chase? Will you panic? Will you get angry? Will you abandon them first? But every time they pulled away, they didn't learn anything new about you. You learned another chapter of their story. Their fears, their patterns, their unspoken wounds were all written in that space they thought was empty. They didn't realize that distance speaks louder than words, and that every retreat paints a clearer picture of who they truly are beneath the surface. With each silent test, you saw more of their emotional blueprint. You saw how quickly they shut down when intimacy reached a depth they weren't prepared to handle. You noticed that their withdrawal wasn't a punishment. It was a reflex, a survival habit formed long before you entered their life. You saw how they clung to independence, not out of strength, but out of fear. How they avoided reliance because relying on someone once ended in disappointment. You weren't confused by their push-pull. You recognized it as emotional muscle memory. And you weren't naive. You were decoding their behavior in real time. Every time they went silent, you didn't hear rejection. You heard fear. Fear of being seen. Fear of being needed. Fear of losing themselves in connection. Fear of disappointing someone they secretly admired. Each test revealed another insecurity. The belief that they're better off alone, the belief that closeness is unsafe, the belief that love inevitably suffocates or betrays. You could see the inner child behind every disappear and return cycle, waiting to be proved wrong, but expecting to be proved right. And while they thought they were evaluating your loyalty, they were actually exposing their emotional limits. Their silence showed you their tolerance for vulnerability. Their distance showed you their threshold for connection. Their unpredictability showed you how overwhelmed they became when feelings got too strong. They revealed the truth of their attachment wounds without saying a single word, and you watched everything unfold with a quiet understanding that startled them more than any emotional reaction would have. Because while they were testing whether you'd stay, you were learning whether they were capable of staying themselves, and that difference matters. You weren't clinging to them, you were studying them. You weren't wondering what you did wrong. You were observing what they couldn't yet do right. You weren't losing yourself in the silence, you were gaining clarity through it. They thought their distance would create confusion, but it created insight. They thought their silence would make you insecure, but it made you perceptive. They thought their retreat would hide their truth, but it revealed everything they never intended to show. In the end, their silent tests didn't expose your loyalty. They exposed their fear, and that fear told you more about them than their words ever could. You didn't fall for them, you understood them. And that's what unsettles them the most. Most people fall in love with the surface, the charm, the emotional distance, the mystery that avoidants so carefully maintain. Avoidants are used to admiration without intimacy, connection without depth, affection without full awareness. They're accustomed to being wanted but not known. But you weren't swept up by their surface. You didn't fall for the mask. You saw behind it. You saw the subtle hesitations, the cracks in their confidence, the longing they tried to bury under their independence. And understanding them on that level was something they never prepared for, because anyone can be loved. But to be understood, that's an emotional exposure avoidants aren't equipped to handle. Love, they can manage. It's predictable, it's familiar, it's something they can keep at a distance. Understanding, however, is something else entirely. Understanding gets past the layers. It gets past the defense mechanism. It gets past the stories they tell themselves about why they push people away. And when someone understands them deeply, the way you did, they can't hide. They can't disappear into their usual emotional escape routes because understanding creates visibility, and visibility makes them feel vulnerable in a way nothing else does. You didn't fall for their mixed signals, you recognized the fear behind them. You didn't fall for their aloof persona, you sensed how sensitive they truly were. You didn't fall for the space they created, you knew it was their way of maintaining emotional safety. You weren't fooled by their detachment because you understood it wasn't rejection, it was self-preservation. You understood their triggers, their survival patterns, their emotional wiring. You saw them in ways they've spent years trying to avoid, seeing themselves. Avoidants often believe that if someone truly knew them, their fears, their insecurities, their contradictions, they'd be rejected. They believe being understood is dangerous because it strips away their control. It leaves them exposed, open, vulnerable, and vulnerability to an avoidant feels like standing unprotected in a storm. But your understanding didn't come with judgment. It didn't come with pressure. It didn't come with demands. It came with empathy, the one thing that disarms them more than anything else. And that's why your presence unsettled them. You didn't treat them like a puzzle to solve or a project to fix. You treated them like a human being with emotional logic, emotional history, and emotional wounds. You saw the whole picture. And when someone like you understands someone like them, the dynamic changes. They can no longer hide behind their distance. They can no longer pretend they don't care. They can no longer rely on silence as their shield, because understanding bypasses all of that. They realize you didn't fall because you were blinded. You stayed because you were aware. And awareness, especially in the hands of an empath, is something an avoidant has never truly known how to handle. Because love can be kept at arm's length, but understanding sits right beside them, quietly dismantling every wall they've ever built. Avoidants spend their entire emotional life believing one thing: if someone sees too much of me, they'll eventually leave. So they try to stay just out of reach, close enough to feel connected, distant enough to feel safe. But when they pulled back from you and you didn't shatter, something in their internal narrative cracked. They expected your world to tilt toward them, for you to prove you needed them, for you to chase panic or over explain your worth. But you didn't. You stayed still. You stayed grounded. You stayed yourself. And that's when they realized the real danger wasn't losing you. The danger was that you had already seen them, seen their patterns, seen their fears, seen the moments they pretended to be strong but were actually terrified, seen the way they used distance as armor, silence as a shield, detachment as protection. Avoidance hide behind behavior that looks confident on the surface, but is entirely rooted in self-preservation. As they fear that if someone sees behind the facade, the guilt, the insecurity, the fragile attachment system, that person will eventually walk away. But you didn't judge them. You didn't corner them. You didn't expose them. You simply understood. And that shook them more than anything else ever could. Because while most people react to avoidant behavior with anger, confusion, or desperate pursuit, you responded with clarity. And clarity is a mirror an avoidant doesn't know how to face. Your calmness revealed the truth they never wanted confronted. You weren't attached because you were blind. You were attached because you were aware. You saw the story behind their silence. You saw the childhood wounds hiding behind their independence. You saw the longing they tried to bury under emotional distance. And when they retreated, fully expecting you to crumble, you didn't. Not because you didn't care, but because their retreat didn't destabilize you. It simply confirmed what you already knew. Their withdrawal had nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with their fear. This is the moment their internal panic begins. Because if you could see them that clearly without them saying a word, then you also had the power to walk away at any time, fully informed and fully self-possessed. Avoidance, fear abandonment, yes, but they fear being known even more. Being known means losing control. Being known means someone can predict their defense mechanisms. Being known means someone can walk away with the emotional blueprint they never meant to give. And that's exactly what happened. They didn't lose power. When you stopped chasing, they lost power when you understood them. Because once someone sees an avoidant clearly, the avoidant can no longer hide behind the behaviors that once kept them safe. You weren't dangerous because you could leave. You were dangerous because you could see avoidance survive on one assumption: if I pull away, you won't understand why, you'll just react. Most people do. Most people panic. Most people misinterpret the silence. Most people fill the distance with overthinking, chasing, or self-blame. But you weren't most people. And that changed everything. Because when they ran, you didn't fall apart. You didn't misunderstand their patterns. You didn't confuse their retreat with rejection. Instead, you saw the architecture behind it, the scaffolding of old wounds, the wiring of past abandonment, the instinctual reflex they've used their whole life to survive emotional closeness. You were naive. You were observant. You were intuitive. You were emotionally fluent in a language they never expected anyone to be able to read. And avoidants don't know how to handle being read that clearly. They counted on the usual script. They distance. You chase. They feel overwhelmed. You feel insecure. Repeat. But your response broke that cycle in one quiet, powerful moment. Because instead of spiraling, you understood. Instead of chasing, you stayed grounded. Instead of interpreting their silence as a test you needed to pass, you recognized it as a reflex. They didn't even fully understand themselves. This is the moment their illusion of emotional control collapses. Not because you confronted them, not because you punished them, but because your clarity meant you saw both versions of them. The avoidant who pushed you away, and the wounded person underneath who desperately hoped you wouldn't leave. And avoidants don't fear love, they fear being seen in this way. Because being seen means someone can differentiate between their protective behaviors and their real self. Being seen means someone can hold them accountable without attacking. Being seen means someone can love them without being fooled by the distance. When they realized you weren't naive, a shift happened in them that felt dangerous. Not dangerous because you would hurt them, but dangerous because you could now predict them. You could anticipate their pullbacks. You could feel the emotional temperature drop before they acted. You could sense when fear hijacked their affection, and you didn't take any of it personally. For an avoidant, that is terrifying because now the running doesn't give them power, it exposes them. You saw the difference between avoidance and apathy. You saw the difference between fear and indifference. You saw the difference between emotional distance and emotional disinterest. And avoidants rely on those differences being misunderstood. But you understood deeply. And when someone understands an avoidant this clearly, running stops being a safe strategy. It stops being a shield. It stops being a place to hide. Because now they know you weren't holding on to a fantasy of who they could be. You were responding to who they actually were. And once an avoidant realizes you see the truth behind their defenses, running stops feeling protective. It starts feeling exposed.